The reason for the war did not have to look for a long time. He turned up himself, thanks to the recklessness of the Crimean Tatars, who often did not pay attention to any agreements signed by the sultans with their neighbors. In 1686 year, they staged another raid on the southern borders of the hetmanate, which from a legal point of view, was a direct violation of the Treaty of Bakhchisaray. In Moscow, the news of the raid was greeted with joy. It was decided to gather an army of at least 100,000 people. I repeat, it was not about a raid, but about the complete conquest of the Crimea. The army consisted of an equestrian noble militia, 40,000 archers, and 20,000 soldiers of a foreign system, that is, regiments armed and organized in the European manner, and trained by European officers under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, who were to be joined by 50,000 Cossacks under the command of Hetman Samoilovich. Prince Vasily Vasilyevich Golitsyn, the first minister, favorite and lover of Princess Sophia, was put at the head of the army. The personality is in many ways outstanding. One of the most educated people in Russia at that time, a scribe, a connoisseur of foreign languages, who also seriously drafted a project for the liberation of peasants from serfdom, who also had military training and military experience, served at one time in one of the regiments of the foreign system, participated in the Chigirin campaigns, then held high government positions. The army from different places moved to the place of General Assembly. Alas, Russian sloppiness has shown itself in all its glory. The number of taps was counted by many thousands. Not deserters as a matter of fact, but simply Razdolbaev, who did not show up for service on time, trudging slowly. One example. At the review in Moscow, 894 people were counted in the soldiers' regiment of General Patrick Gordon, and only 789 came to the Akturka River. Another sad feature was the lack of discipline in some units, especially a large regiment, the same noble militia, numbering 3,500 people, was loose. Even the almighty, and by no means gentle Golitsyn, coped with them with great difficulty. It took 2 whole months to distribute people on the shelves, wait for the Nechiks, and advance to the main gathering place of all the forces of the Merlet River, the left tributary of the Vorskla. At the beginning of May 1687 year, Golitsyn's army finally set out on a campaign, slowly, with great precautions, although there was no sign of the Tatars yet. They walked in a huge quadrangle, more than a mile along the front, and 2 versts in length, in the middle of the infantry, flanked by a convoy of 20,000 wagons and an icon, engaged in combat security and reconnaissance. Hetman Samoilovich joined Golitsyn on the Samara River. On the 13th, and yet the unlucky day of June, when the army approached the Crimean steppe, it suddenly turned out that the steppe ahead was burning for a huge length. Instead of grass, there was a thick layer of ash everywhere you looked. The grass was definitely set on fire. More than 100 years ago, this is exactly what the Russians did in almost the same places to stop another Crimean raid, and stopped. The Tatars, who had nothing left to feed their horses, turned back. Now the same misfortune happened to Golitsyn. At first, he continued to move, made 3 more day crossings, but when there was not so much left to Perekop, only 200 versts, he had to stop. The weakened horses could not pull the guns and fell. The same thing happened with the bulls, the main draft force. After the military council, it was decided that we would have to turn back. There is simply no other way out, and the army hastily moved back. However, no one reproached for such an inglorious outcome. On the contrary, as happened not only in those years, and not only in Russia, they did exactly the opposite. The ruler Sophia solemnly announced to the people that Prince Golitsyn and his brave army had performed many glorious feats, bravely fighting the Bizermans. On the shore of Merlet, the returning Boyar Sheremetyev met with a royal gracious word for a successful campaign, and awards for Golitsyn and the voivodes. Of course, this cannot be called a defeat in any way. Neither on the way to the Crimea, nor on the way back, there was not a single battle. In general, not a single Tatar appeared even on the horizon. It's just a serious setback. Why is it not easier? Hetman Samoilovich turned out to be the most extreme victim in general. By that time, a serious conspiracy had been formed against him, led by rather big people. General Clark Kokubi is the second person after the hetman in the hierarchy of that time, and General Yesal Mazepa, the same one who commanded the hired regiments of the hetman's personal guard at that time. They and a handful of lower ranks had already compiled an extensive denunciation of the hetman, and now, having heard about the unsuccessful campaign and the reason for its failure, they happily added another accusation. The steppe, where the hetman's Cossacks, not the Tatars, were set on fire by secret agreement with the Crimean Khan. The denunciation went to Moscow, by no means anonymous, signed honor by honor. The first one was signed by Kokubi. Mazepa, according to his position, it was quite possible to sign the second one, but his autograph was modestly tucked somewhere in the middle. Some of the military commanders seriously believed in this denunciation, believing that it was unprofitable for the Cossacks to conquer the Crimea, which would further strengthen Moscow's influence on them. However, not all of them. Patrick Gordon did not accuse Samoilovich in his diaries, speaking of treason only as a rumor. And Franz Lefort did not believe in the hetman's guilt at all. It is quite possible that Tsarevna Sofia, Golitsyn, and the top leadership of that time did not particularly believe this accusation. However, faith is faith, but there are also higher state interests. As has happened more than once in other countries and at other times, it was much more profitable to believe that the case had failed because of an unexpected betrayal in the ranks, since a specific traitor was at hand and solid people spoke out against him. In a word, Samoilovich was deposed and sent to Siberia with the whole family. His place, as a result of the efforts of Moscow, who used all his influence, was taken by Ivan Mazepa, with whom Russia later had to cry a lot. At the same time, rumors began to spread that everything turned out from the fact that Mazepa bowed to Golitsyn barrels with 10,000 chervonets. There is no evidence. In fact, this did not contradict the free mores of the century at all. This is when such gifts were in high demand. It is reliably known that Mazepa, as discussed in the future, made considerable gifts to the Russian noblemen more than once, and even to the Tsar himself. On the other, Golitsyn does not seem to be noticed in the bribery. Whatever it was, it is no longer possible to establish the truth. Almost 2 years later, in the early spring of 1689, Golitsyn set out on the Second Crimean Campaign, as part of a serious army of 80,000 reuters, horsemen and soldiers of regiments of a foreign system, 32,000 archers, hetman Cossacks. He had 350 guns with him. They went in the same order as the last time. In contrast to the last campaign, the Khan's son Nuruddin Khalga came out to meet Golitsyn with considerable forces. The first attack was limited to a firefight, with small losses on both sides. But the Tatars returned the next day, and a 3-day battle began, ending with a brutal defeat of the Tatars. The Tatars inflicted great damage on 2 hetman's cavalry regiments, but each time the attack was repulsed by Russian artillery. In the end, the Tatars retreated. Golitsyn lost 1,220 people killed, the Crimeans much more. Emboldened, Golitsyn went forward, but at the very Perekop, he came across a 50,000 Tatar army, under the command of the Khan himself, which was joined by Nuruddin. The Russians were attacked from all sides, but Golitsyn repulsed all the attacks with artillery fire, approached Perekop with a cannon shot, and stopped, not daring to immediately go to the assault. Indecision proved fatal. The army remained without water for 2 days, with a lack of bread. A few more days, and the wagon train with guns would have to be abandoned, because the horses began to die. Golitsyn's military leaders unanimously declared they are ready to serve and shed their blood. Only from the lack of water and the lack of bread, they were exhausted. It is impossible to trade under Perekop, and they would retreat away. Deciding to make a good face at a bad game, Golitsyn began peace negotiations with the Khan, hoping that the Khan would be afraid of the Russian invasion of the Crimea. The prince hoped to get the Khan to stop raiding Poland and the southern Russian borders, not to take tribute, and free all Russian prisoners. Khan, who perfectly understood the situation of the Russian army, delayed the negotiations, waiting for Gur to get even worse. Categorically did not agree to Golitsyn's demands, but he himself demanded 200,000 rubles of tribute unpaid by Russia. I had to retreat. As before, Golitsyn was met on the Merlet River by a messenger with a royal gracious word. Sofia wrote to Golitsyn, "For such glorious victories in the whole world, we favor you mercifully, and we praise you mercifully." Rich gifts rained down not only on Golitsyn and the voivodes, but also on all officers with lower ranks. Another glorious victory was announced to the people again. Actually, unlike the last time, when there was no single shot, now there were some grounds to talk about the victories of Russian weapons. In several battles, the Russian troops won, suffering much smaller losses than the enemy. But the campaign should not have been considered the triumph that the official propaganda screamed about. The main goal, to break into the Crimea and smash the Tatars on their heads, was never achieved. The Crimean campaign stopped for almost 50 years. When Peter the Great took power, Golitsyn was accused, among other things, of unsuccessful Crimean campaigns. Although the main reason for the Tsar's disfavor was, of course, Golitsyn's proximity to Sofia, hated by the Tsar. In August of the same 1689th year, the prince was sent into exile, where he died in 1714th year. It's quite possible he wasn't so much to blame. There is a time for everything, and a time for everything under heaven, said Ecclesiastes. The time to enter the Crimea has definitely not come yet. Other people and a different environment were needed. And hetman Mazepa firmly established himself on the left bank. It is simply impossible to ignore him with the closest attention in the course of our narrative, from the fact that those who have risen to independent Ukraine, the person in question is in every way raised to the shield as an ideological fighter for the independence of Ukraine, which corresponds little to the historical truth. In general, it does not correspond at all. So, Ivan, often called January, Mazepa, who came from the small-scale Russian gentry of the left bank, received an excellent education in Europe. According to contemporaries, he was fluent in Latin, German, Polish. For the borrowed book, the man, there is no denying it, is an outstanding, not a bad diplomat. However, all these qualities do not automatically mean that their owner will certainly be honest and noble. A classic example. Heinrich Himmler's favorite writer was Jules Verne. The singer is just honest and noble heroes, but the SS executioner's favorite books have not changed for the better. Already at the age of 20, Mazepa, by some mysterious ways, got to the court of King January Casimir, where he received the title of the deceased, a low rank, but still a courtier. I didn't find out exactly what the duties of the deceased were at court, but this is most likely one of the many posts where you won't overwork much. There were enough of them at any court. However, over the next few years, Pan Mazepa was engaged in much more serious matters that required not just labor, but considerable intelligence, pretense, and cunning. Conducted sensitive secret negotiations as usual. Diplomats are often not trusted. The interroyal court, the hetmans of the left bank, and the Crimean Khan, and possibly with the Turks, because where the Khan is, there are Turks. It seems that a good court career was being built, but everything suddenly changes dramatically. The first sharp turn in Mazepa's life, and there will be 3 of them in total. Mazepa suddenly leaves the royal court, forever, and goes to the hetmanate. Hardly of his own volition, given Mazepa's ambition. What happened, historians have remained unknown. The authors, who are very unfriendly to Mazepa, willingly retell the fable that had a lot of circulation at that time. Allegedly, Mazepa started a passionate affair with the wife of a noble influential Pan, and he, taking a couple in bed, ordered to tie the lover naked to a horse, smear with tar, sprinkle with feathers, and let the horses into a clean field. Naturally, after such a disgrace, Kadyrov could not return in any way. Actually, it is reliably known that Mazepa, a very good-looking talker, enjoyed great success with the available court beauties. However, for the sake of objectivity, it should be clarified, without going into details, that this story contradicts the chronology of events, and therefore, most likely, was put into circulation by Mazepa's detractors at court. It is hard to believe in another explanation for Mazepa's sudden departure to his homeland, this time sublimely romantic. Allegedly, the fire of Ukrainian patriotism suddenly broke out in Mazepa's heart, with an irresistible force, that drove him away from the damn Lyakhs. Not that character, you know. Most likely, an old-as-the-world story happened. The arrogant Polish gentlemen courtiers treated the Russian gentry as second-class people. And, dissatisfied with the fact that some Cossack is making a successful career under the king, they tried to squeeze out the impudent. This is much more like the truth than stories about an unlucky lover or a mystical call of the motherland. Mazepa's service to the fatherland consisted in the fact that he entered the service of the very Turkish subject hetman Peter Doroshenko, whose army, according to a contemporary, was nothing but a great band of robbers. Despite his bad reputation, Doroshenko maintained the closest diplomatic relations with the left bank, with the Crimeans, and with the Zaporozhye network. That's where Mazepa's previous experience could not be more appropriate. And he, as a personal hetman's envoy, again took up the remaining secret affairs for historians, all the same missions that are not entrusted to official diplomats. And along the way, he rose no less to the head of the hetman's guard. Such a post is always and everywhere given to a person who is completely trusted. Then there was another mystery that could never be explained. Mazepa went as an ambassador to the Crimean Khan, with the protection of both Tatars and Polonyankas from the left bank, a kind of living gift from Doroshenko to his overlord. On the way, the gang of hetman Serko, one of the numerous field commanders in those places, who most often did not obey anyone, flew into this company and took everyone prisoner. Serko, like many, did not suffer from special moral scrupulousness, and, if necessary, entered into any alliances, with one single exception. The hetman still had an iron principle, which he religiously observed. Serko fiercely hated both the Crimean Tatars and their Ukrainian allies, and none of them left him alive. Nobody. However, Maze, who should have parted with his head, remained unharmed, not only executed or tortured, but not even beaten. Historians have not come up with a clear explanation for this until now. Others, for lack of a better one, write that Mazepa, with his experience of diplomacy and secret service, simply charmed the uncouth steppe knight, like a brave hussar lieutenant to a young high school student. That's how he took and charmed. In general, it all ended with the fact that Serko sent Mazepa to the left bank to the local hetman Samoilovich, and he in turn transported an interesting prisoner to Moscow, whose enemy Doroshenko was deservedly considered. And again, everything somehow miraculously worked out. Not that it's bad or Siberia, they never even stroked it with a whip, otherwise information about it would certainly have been preserved. On the contrary, quite friendly conversations went on for a long time, either over tea or vodka. Mazepa was eventually even granted an audience with Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, received the sovereign's salary, and was released into the service of hetman Samoilovich as a man of his own and useful, for whom Moscow vouches. Personally, I see only one explanation. The little man was primitively turned over. Russian intelligence already worked well at that time and had several centuries of experience behind them. Mazepa had to merge the most interesting secrets of Polish hetman Crimean Turkish diplomacy, and he knew them abound. Examples in the history of intelligence mass. At Samoilovich, Mazepa again made a good career, having reached the General Esol, that is, the commander of the Serdyukov mercenary regiments, the personal guard of the hetman. Captain of the Royal Musketeers, and along the way, he engaged in successful commerce on a grand scale. He sent considerable shipments of vodka to Moscow by carts. One important nuance is that in those days in the Moscow state, the production and trade of alcohol were a personal royal monopoly. So according to the realities of that time, such commerce would have been impossible without decent kickbacks by the patron at the very top. That's how, by the way, there was a nasty, cheap booze, flavored with aromatic herbs for decency. Almost a technocrat of that time. People with affluence did not take this in their mouths, but in pubs for ordinary people, the liquor flowed by hand, so that commerce flourished. And the denunciation of Samoilovich has already been written. After becoming hetman, Mazepa continued to diligently bring serious gifts, not only to the highest Moscow dignitary, but also to Tsar Peter himself. Even the exact figures have been preserved in the archives. Peter, 200 ducats, a solid gold coin of that time. To the ubiquitous Menshikov, without whom no such negotiation could do, 1,006 large silver bottles. Golovkin, 1,000 ducats. Sheremetyevo, 500 and silver sets. Shafarev, 500. Dolgoruki, 500. To the secretary of the embassy order, Stepanov, 100. Everyone was fine. So much so, that Mazepa, with the filing of Moscow patrons, became the Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, in the most official way. And it is not known exactly how much it cost the hetman, but such things have never been done for nothing. For 21 years of rule, 1687th, 1708, the hetman did not acquire popular love, rather the opposite. Like his predecessors, he generously distributed to his supporters, in hereditary possession, I note, lands, villages and hamlets, together not with serfs yet, but with peasants assigned to them. Moreover, the Universal of 1700 and the first year introduced a mandatory weekly two-day corvée, and for those peasants who lived on their own land, legally free, not assigned to any of the foremen. How, in your opinion, will all this contribute to people's love? Even Mazepa's admirer, Professor Grushevsky, one of the theorists of independence, melancholically admitted, of course, this new serfdom terribly excited the peasantry, who still had fresh in their memory the times without landlords when they ruled on free land. Bitter resentment rose in him against the foreman, who so deftly and quickly managed to take him under her command. People breathed special anger at Hetman Mazepa. Suspecting that he was a nobleman and a Pole, as he was called, he tried to establish Polish, pan-Russian orders in Ukraine. The people were very suspicious of all the undertakings of him and the foreman. Such is the paradox. In Poland, Maze was considered a Cossack, and in his homeland, a Lak. And people's suspicions, by the way, were not groundless at all. It will only take a few decades, and all suspicions will come true. Grushevsky, a great master of conjuring with a real story, still tried to justify his idol by the fact that Mazepa was allegedly a forced laborer. A kind of puppet, who regularly carried out the secret orders of the Muscovites, who, according to their villainous habit, sought to destroy Ukrainian liberties and enslave everyone. One bad luck. In the archives of the Collegium of Little Russian Affairs, Peter's decree of the exact opposite content has been preserved. The hetman was ordered to supervise the Little Russian landowners to keep them from the cruelty of extortion of unnecessary work. It's not about humanity. Simply, Moscow did not yet fully control the hetmanate and was afraid of the riots of the black people. It has long been known that an experienced blacksmith will transform a simple peasant scythe into a weapon in no time. Turn the blade vertically to the shaft, and here you have a natural halberd. By the standards of that time, the weapon is serious, against which the bayonet somehow does not dance. This decree did not reach the masses, did not appear at all. The hetman hid it away, without showing it to anyone, and released several station wagons, with which he prescribed the harshest way to press those peasants who resist enslavement or even flee to Russia, put them in prisons, beat them mercilessly with whips, or even hang them. For 20 years, Mazepa had no intention of defending Ukrainian liberties. He served Russia faithfully. He couldn't have fared better in the Moscow service. Together with the Russian regiments, the hetman Cossacks participated in the southern campaigns, for which Mazepa was the second after Field Marshal Sheremetyev to receive the Order of St. Andrew, Peter himself the Fourth. Again, as part of the Russian army, Mazepa fought in Livonia, in Poland, suppressed the uprising of the Don Cossack Ataman Kondraty Bulavin, and of course, continued to successfully sell vodka. One does not interfere with the other. For his faithful service, Peter showered the hetman with gifts and awards. Money, sables, velvet, the spoilage of jewelry by Salmon Sterlitus, of the royal cookery, the mentioned princely title, finally, the whole parish in Russia given into hereditary possession. In short, an impeccable track record and a solid position. But this is in Russia. At home, in the hetmanate, things were not so cloudless. Perhaps that is not cloudless at all. Little by little, the enslaved black people did not harbor the slightest affection for the hetman, and therefore, Mazepa, following the example of Samoilovich, hired Serdyukov and company men to protect his person, very often from Germans, Magyars, and even Poles. Local Cossack regiments tried as often as possible to send to fight somewhere far away. The Cossacks, although free people, also disliked the hetman. With the tops too, things were not the best, as it is sung in a famous song, and there are always not enough sweet cakes for everyone. Part of the deprived foremen began to seriously plot against the hetman. It was headed by a general clerk, something like the Minister of Foreign Affairs Kokubi, who, as sometimes happens, had the well-known mixed up with the personal. 65-year-old Mazepa caught fire with the most ardent passion for Kokubi's daughter, his goddaughter, the young beauty of Muntru Maria. The passion was mutual. Matria even ran away from her parents' house and stayed with Mazepa for 4 days, obviously not to listen to poems, of which Mazepa wrote her a lot. When she returned, Mazepa, according to all the rules, asked Kokubi for her hand. Kokubi resolutely refused. The act is not quite clear. To agree, the general clerk from the deprived would certainly have moved into the inner circle. On the one hand, Matria was Mazepa's goddaughter, and according to the rules of that time, sleeping with her goddaughter was like sleeping with her own daughter. But such influential persons as Mazepa and Kokubi could easily agree with the churchmen and remove the issue. Church hierarchies are also people. Then there is aversion, but about it a little later. The moment came when the conspirators saw a serious opportunity to overthrow the hetman. Another turmoil was rumbling merrily in Poland. 2 contenders for the throne appeared there at once, and each was duly elected king by his supporters. Saxon Elector August the Strong and Polish magnate Stanislaw Leszczynski. Both of these characters did not make the slightest contribution to the story. August, however, got the nickname for a reason. He had serious strength. He bent silver plates into a pipe, tied a poker in a knot. Yes, in addition, he became famous for a downright transcendent, even by the standards of the frivolous 18th century, as if more delicately, a Kobylias. Historians have counted 300 illegitimate children with him. Perhaps some were missed, so there could have been more of them. And the number of mistresses, more or less permanent and disposable, does not lend itself to accounting at all. August got into the taste so much that he made his own daughter a mistress. Out of wedlock. Leszczynski was a completely colorless person. In full accordance with the saying, which they themselves composed, Poland is strong with strife, the noble lords, divided into 2 camps, began a natural war. True, none of the parties managed to inflict a complete and final defeat on the other, and therefore, both of them decided to turn to strong patrons. August bet on Moscow, his rival on Stockholm. Russian regiments and Mazepa Cossacks, and the Swedish King Charles XII entered Poland from different sides. That's where it's already blazed up to the sky. And at that very moment, Mazepa entered into a secret correspondence with Stanislaw Leszczynski. Mazepa promised to bring the smallest 20,000 Cossacks under the banner of King Stas. And the king promised to make Mazepa a hereditary Russian prince and give him the whole of Ukraine, albeit as part of Poland, but with broad autonomy. The Poles even composed a coat of arms for Mazepa and sent her a drawing. By the way, by that time, she had managed to marry the general judge of the hetmanate, but this did not change anything. Kokubi and Colonel Iskra found out something about the negotiations with the Poles and urgently sent a signal to Moscow. This is exactly what Pushkin wrote about later in the poem Poltava. A dashing Cossack rushes to Moscow day and night on a dashing horse. Why does he value his hat? Because the denunciation is sewn up in it. Denunciation of the hetman villain to Tsar Peter from Kokubi. In reality, things were not so romantic. There was no dashing advice. The signal was delivered to Moscow by a certain monk Nicanor on foot, who reached the place with a sort of grey mouse, and vegetable gardens, an inconspicuous uninteresting wanderer, a man of God, of which there are plenty on the roads. It's much more reliable this way. The dashing Cossack is a noticeable figure.